Good evening, everyone. Early in 1968, a number of events happened in naval submarine service. Many of you probably remember the story about the Scorpion. Steve Frasher, retired commander, going to talk about these surprising events and what led up to it. And I think you're all going to be quite surprised as to what led up to the loss of the Scorpion. But let me give you a little background about Steve. He graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1970. Steve was commander of the submarine, the USS Scorpion, SSN 594. He served as the operations officer during the Gulf War attack on Mosul, Iraq. He was assigned to foreign military sales oversight in Cairo, and that's where he retired from in 1995. Ladies and gentlemen, retired Commander Steve Frasher.
I want to thank you very much for letting me come back and talk to you again. In this presentation, I'm going to review the timeline of events that led up to the loss of the USS Scorpion. I will discuss the possible reasons for this loss and look at the facts that support the various reasons. None of the information that I'm using is currently classified. All of it has been released to the public. I will start with a little background information for those of you that are not submariners. During the World War II, the U.S. Navy built several diesel-powered submarines. These were used to locate and sink enemy surface ships and merchant ships. They were about 312 feet long. They could submerge to a depth of about 300 feet. That's about as deep as the height of the Statue of Liberty. Hull design was like a surface ship of the day, so they could go 21 knots on the surface, but only 9 knots submerged. They had a crew of 72 enlisted and 9 officers. The U.S. Navy began its nuclear submarine program with the USS Nautilus, SSN 571, commissioned in September of 1954. This is basically a World War II diesel-powered submarine with a nuclear reactor replacing the battery in the diesel boats. Being nuclear powered meant they didn't have to surface to ventilate and charge the batteries. They had the same hull shape and design as the diesel boat. It was 320 feet long, but it could dive to 700 feet. She could travel 22 knots on the surface and 23 knots submerged.
Oh.
She had a crew of 92 enlisted and 13 officers. The U.S. Navy went through several attack submarine modifications over the next 5 years. This picture shows a World War II submarine at the top, the Nautilus in the middle, and a ballistic submarine at the bottom. They are not to scale. The World War II sub is 311 feet, the Nautilus 320, and the George Washington 381. And just quickly, before we go, I can point out here, this is, we'll see it again later on, but this is the missile compartment where the missiles are stored. These design modifications eventually resulted in the USS Skipjack, SSN 585, commissioned in April of 1959. Skipjack changed the hull shape to a teardrop. You can see that the bow is complete, making the ship much more efficient in moving underwater. These boats were designed to track and sink surface ships as well as act as surveillance vessels, tracking enemy ships and submarines and gathering critical tactical data. These ships could travel 15 knots on the surface, and 33 knots submerged. They could submerge to 700 feet, 2 football. On July 1958, the Navy began construction of ballistic missile submarines. These Cold War deterrents had a very different purchase and function. Here you can see those missile compartments that I was referring to, the hatches there. The George Washington class had a 130-foot missile compartment carrying 16 nuclear ballistic missiles, inserted between the ship's control navigation area and the reactor compartment. She was commissioned in December 1959 and had a crew of 130 enlisted and 15 officers. She traveled 25 knots while submerged. During the upswing of the Cold War, the ballistic missile submarines were used as a deterrent to nuclear war because there are 16 warheads. They were submerged for long periods of time and not easy to detect. The U.S. attack submarines were key in detecting movements of Russian ships and their attempts to spy on the U.S. In August 1961, the USS Frasher was commissioned. Frasher was the lead boat of her class of nuclear attack submarines. The class was unique in the U.S. Navy. They were designed to go much deeper than any submarine to date. She could travel 33 knots while submerged, and she could submerge to 1,300. nearly twice that of previous versions. She had a crew of 96 enlisted and 16 officers. On April 1963, the Frasher sank during a deep diving test about 220 miles east of Boston, Massachusetts, killing all 129 crew and shipyard personnel on board. It was the first loss of a U.S. Navy nuclear submarine. Documents showed that the loss was due to design and construction flaws. Basically, a surface ship and previous submarines had used seawater brought into the ship and piped throughout it to cool components such as motors, generators, and even turbine gears. The Frasher was designed to go to 1,300 feet, resulting in a much higher pressure in the piping, which exceeded the capability of the welded joints and fittings and resulted in flooding, causing the loss of the ship. The normal process used to bring the submarine to the surface also failed, resulting in the boat sinking to the bottom of the ocean. Her loss was a watershed for the U.S. Navy, leading to the implementation of a rigorous submarine safety program known as SubSafe. This program redesigned the cooling method inside the submarine using external water only in one small location, cooling the water in a heat exchanger, and that low pressure was the pipe throughout the ship. SubSafe also redesigned and strengthened the hull and pipe fittings and redesigned the surfacing equipment process. It also instituted significant safety checks and design reviews. The Navy then directed all commissioned submarines to undergo extensive overhaul and incorporate the SubSafe design modifications. This process changed the time of a periodic submarine overhaul from 9 months to 36 months. The extended time in the shipyard meant that the ships were operationally available, were assigned longer operating schedules, and other submarines were cycled back to complete this work. It was during this time that the USS Scorpion, the skipjack class, was in the Mediterranean completing her assigned mission of following Soviet submarines. She was scheduled to proceed straight back to Norfolk, Virginia, but on 17 May 1968, she was directed on a top secret mission more than 1,000 miles southwest down toward the Canary Islands, off the coast of Africa. A group of Soviet Navy ships were conducting a hydroacoustic operation in this area. This operation involved 2 hydrographic survey vessels, 1 submarine rescue ship, 1 guided missile destroyer, 1 fleet oiler, and later an Echo 2 class submarine. The observed exercise was unlike anything seen before, and the operation didn't make any sense to U.S. Navy officials. They wanted to check it out. The Scorpion entered the Atlantic, met a tug off-road to Spain, and offloaded 2 of the crewmen who had urgent reason to get home for personal reasons. Then she continued into the Atlantic. She was scheduled to check in with headquarters every 24 hours. On 22 May, she missed the check-in. On 23 May, she missed the check-in again. Mike Hannon, a second-class radioman assigned to the submarine headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia, coming back to work that morning, said he was surprised when he entered the communications center. Instead of the normal half-dozen radiomen quietly sitting at work, there was a large group of senior officers, including several admirals and a Marine Corps general. They had taken over the workspace and were talking among themselves in hushed voices. Hannon had never seen any of them before. Within minutes of his arrival that morning, he overheard conversations among the high-ranking strangers that made it clear the Scorpion had disappeared and its crew of 99 officers and enlisted men were considered dead. Scorpion was scheduled to arrive in Norfolk on 27 May, 4 days later. There were messages sent up the chain of command to Navy officials seeking guidance on how to handle the quote situation. On Friday, 24 May, ComSub-led officials who suspected the Scorpion was already lost with all hands had announced that it would be arriving in Norfolk at 1 p.m. the following Monday, on schedule. And worse, they said nothing 3 days later to dissuade several dozen families from standing vigil for hours on the pier in a raging nor'easter. Obviously, the ship did not arrive. By Tuesday morning, May 28th, the story of the missing submarine led the front pages of newspapers all over the country. The previous evening, in an impromptu news conference at the Pentagon, Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Thomas H. Moore had offered a slender reed of hope to the families of the crew. The weather is very, very bad out there, Moore told them, but the weather may abate, and the ship may well should be held back by the storm, and she could be able to proceed to port. However, Admiral Moore already knew the Scorpion had in fact sunk with entire 99-person crew 5 days earlier on May 22nd. For the next week, dozens of Atlantic Fleet ships and patrol aircraft scoured the open ocean. After several days, the search effort shrank to 5 destroyers, 5 submarines, and a fleet oiler, proceeding in 2 groups down the Scorpion's track, coming back toward Norfolk. The 2 groups, positioned 12 hours apart for maximum surveillance, steamed in a line abreast, with their lookouts peering intently through their binoculars and radar equipment, staring at their scopes for any sign of a missing subject. They found nothing. So what was the reason for this high-level deception? The Scorpion had not been in contact for 5 days after it was initially sent to surveil the Soviet ships. This is where the story begins. The loss of the Scorpion was initially attributed to her not completing the subsafe upgrades, but she had been in the Mediterranean Sea, and then in the Atlantic near the Azores when she was lost. She had not been on any deep diving mission. Later, the US Navy changed their story and said she was sunk by a hot run torpedo. This occurs when a torpedo becomes activated while still in the torpedo tube, and it can explode and blow up in place. The ship was reportedly located by the US Navy on the bottom of the ocean floor on 30 October 1968, 5 months later. The pictures taken support no internal torpedo was to blame. You can see the entire bottom. There was some damage from hitting the bottom, but no evidence of an internal torpedo explosion. There was no outboard explosion, nor any indication of complete subsafe failure. The only damage was a break inward near the middle of the ship, which could be indicative of an external torpedo. But why would any external torpedo why would any external source send a torpedo to sink the Scorpion? Why all the apparent collusion among the top officers at Subland? All went silent and there was no answer for 40 years. On 15 April 2008, a book was published, All Hands Down, the true story of the Soviet attack on the USS Scorpion, co-authored by Kenneth Sewell and Jerome Priestley. Kenneth Sewell is a nuclear engineer and a US Navy veteran who spent 5 years aboard the USS Scorpion, a fast attack submarine, and the Scorpion conducted several special operations missions. Jerome Priestley is a published co-author of some 40 books, including the New York Times bestsellers by Tom Clancy. These 2 co-authors shared a significant amount of submarine warfare expertise. Based on All Hands Down, a possible explanation of the Scorpion becomes very interesting. I will discuss the explanation in historical order. I will start with the North Korean capture of the USS Pueblo. USS Pueblo, AGER-2, was a Banner-class environmental research ship, but she was attached to the US Navy intelligence as a spy ship. On January 23, 1968, she was engaged in routine surveillance of the North Korean coast when it was intercepted by North Korean patrol boats. According to US reports, the Pueblo was in international waters almost 16 miles from shore. The North Koreans turned their guns on the lightly armed vessel and demanded its surrender. The Americans attempted to escape and the North Koreans opened fire, wounding the commander and 2 others. With capture inevitable, the Americans stalled for time, destroying the classified information aboard while taking further fire. Several more crew members were wounded. Finally, the Pueblo was boarded and taken to Wonsan. There, the 83-man crew was bound and blindfolded and transported to Pyongyang, where they were charged with spying within North Korea's 12-mile territory limit and imprisoned. It was the biggest crisis in 2 years of increased tension and minor skirmishes between the United States and North Korea. The United States maintained that the vessel was in international waters at the time of the incident, and any purported evidence supplied by North Korea to support its statements had been fabricated. But on December 23, 1968, exactly 11 months after the Pueblo's capture, US and North Korean negotiators reached a settlement to resolve the crisis. Under the settlement's terms, the United States Navy admitted the ship had intruded into North Korean territory, apologized for the action, and pledged to cease any future such action. That day, the surviving 82 crewmen walked one by one across the bridge of no return at Panmunjom to freedom in South Korea. They were hailed as heroes and returned home to the United States in time for Christmas. USS Pueblo is still held by North Korea today. It officially remains a commissioned vessel of the United States Navy. In fact, today it's used as a tour location for North Koreans. Key to our story is the fact that the Pueblo had on board several units of the most current cryptographic communications. The crew tried to destroy them all, but at least one KW-7 Orestes cryptographic machine was taken intact by the North Koreans. This was a serious loss for the US Navy and put all communications at risk. It is suspected that it was immediately passed to the Soviet Union. Fortunately, the device required a current and updated crypto key, so all the US Navy had to do was change the key, and the device would be useless to the Soviet Union. Change was immediately made, and the key was then updated periodically. But another key event occurred in Norfolk, Virginia naval base. Late in 1967, before the KW-7 was given to the Soviet Union by North Korea, a United States Navy Chief Warrant Officer and Communications Specialist, who was a member of the Commander Submarine Force Atlantic, began spying for the Soviet Union. His name was John Anthony Walker. This event is the real key to our story. Late in 1955, Walker joined the U.S. Navy as a radio. He served on board a destroyer escort, then an aircraft carrier. Then he qualified for submarines and served on board several submarines. He moved up rank, becoming a chief warrant officer, and became qualified to handle high-level cryptographic equipment in 1960. He purchased some properties on the side and opened a bar to gain some extra income, cover expense for his wife and 4 children. Unfortunately, these efforts left him strapped for cash. During off-duty periods, he drove a cab and even shuttled rental cars between cities. There was still not enough. In October 1967, Chief Warrant Officer Walker had been assigned to a watch officer at the Atlantic Fleet Submarine Force headquarters in Norfolk, Virginia. In this new role, he learned more and more about the activities of the U.S. military and the Soviet military. He would later say he began to realize that the Soviets were not the aggressive adversary that the Americans feared. The farce of the Cold War and the absurd war machine that spawned a comment was an ever-growing pathetic joke. He decided to correct the military imbalance and balance his checkbook by leaking top-secret information to Moscow. He photocopied a top-secret document, drove to Washington, D.C., and walked into the Soviet embassy. He asked to see security personnel. The embassy personnel at first suspected this was a trap, but when they saw the information concerning submarines and it was similar to some they had received from other sources, Walker's information was accepted as genuine. He worked with the embassy, he established dead drop locations. He would go to a dead drop location, pick up money and instructions, and drop off information. He was a spy from 1967 until 1985. According to the New York Times, during these 18 years as a Soviet spy, Walker helped the Soviets decipher more than 1 million encrypted naval messages, organizing a spy operation that is sometimes described as the most damaging Soviet spy ring. Walker provided a huge array of secret Navy and U.S. documents to America's Cold War adversaries. These included operational orders, war plans, technical manuals, and intelligence digests. At Norfolk, he used his status as an armed forces courier to smuggle documents from headquarters to his bachelor officer quarters room where he photographed. There was such a stream of papers, he had to be selective. Walker estimated that photographing just 20 of the hundreds of messages that crossed his desk during the watch would require more than 100 rolls of film over 6 months. Yet everything he left at the dead drop needed to fit in a single cylinder. Walker's wife became suspicious of their newfound financial wealth. One day, she discovered a bag full of classified material in their home. But he had become abusive to her, so she decided not to say it. They were later divorced, and her drinking increased. Finally, in 1984, after 18 years of undetected espionage, Walker's program fell apart. His ex-wife was drinking and decided to call the Boston FBI. The agent became aware she'd been drinking and asked why she was just now coming forward. He began to suspect she was just angry and trying to get even with her ex-husband. He filed a report, but did not follow up. A month later, another agent happened to see the report and decided it should be sent to the Norfolk FBI for their findings. 4 months later, the full investigation was opened by the Norfolk. Finally, on 20 May 1985, Walker was arrested. So how does this fit into the story? In late 1967, Walker told the Soviet Union they needed to get one of the new U.S. crypto businesses, the KW-7. Thanks to the USS Pueblo, they now had one. And he was providing the maintenance manual, all upgrades and improvements, as well as other information for crypto devices in the U.S. Navy. This link is the key which connects all events together. Every encrypted message sent by any U.S. Navy ship or command could be immediately read by the Soviet Union. And the U.S. Navy had no knowledge of this breach for 18 years. Let's go back. On 24 February 1968, the Soviet diesel submarine K-129 was tasked to commence a Pacific patrol with an inspection completion date of 5 May 1968. On departure from the Kamchatka base on 24 February, she reached deep water, conducted a test dive, returned to the surface, and reported by radio that all was well, proceeded on patrol. No further communication was received from the K-129. Despite normal radio check-ins required when she crossed the 180th meridian, and when she arrived at her control area about 700 miles northwest of Hawaii. Communications were lost when the K-129 was in the Bering Sea before she had crossed the 180th meridian. She eventually sank to the bottom, 1,560 miles northwest of. By mid-March, Soviet naval authorities in Kamchatka became concerned that the K-129 had missed 2 consecutive radio check-ins. First, she was instructed by normal fleet broadcast to break radio silence and contact headquarters. Later, more urgent communications all went unanswered. By the 3rd week of March, Soviet naval headquarters declared the K-129 missing and organized a massive air, surface, and subsurface search and rescue effort in the North Pacific from Kamchatka to Vladivostok. This highly unusual Soviet surge deployment to the Pacific was correctly analyzed by U.S. intelligence as probably in reaction to the loss of the submarine. The U.S. Navy also had a secret system of underwater sensor cables called SOSUS. This was a sound surveillance system designed by the U.S. Navy to track Soviet submarines. The system was classified and not known by the Soviets. The cables were located on the bottom of the ocean and used to keep track of the submarines as they approached the U.S. coast. U.S. SOSUS naval facilities in the North Pacific were alerted and requested to review recent acoustic records to identify any possible associated signal. Several SOSUS arrays recorded a possibly related event on 8 March 1968. Upon examination, we produced sufficient triangulation and lines of bearing to provide the Navy with the locus for the probable wreck site. One source characterized the acoustic signal as an isolated single sign of an explosion, good-sized bang. Soviet search efforts lacking the equivalent of the U.S. SOSUS system proved unable to locate K-129, and the Soviet naval activity in the North Pacific returned to normal, and the K-129 was declared lost. So what's significant about the K-129? K-129 was a Soviet diesel-powered submarine, but she carried 3, you can see behind the sail there, carried 3 of the Soviets' most modern ballistic missiles with a range of 750 miles. These were to be fired at the U.S. in the event of a war. She also carried 2 nuclear warhead torpedoes, also the most recent Soviet. The SOSUS system, plus the use of a submarine with remotely operated underwater sonar scanner, found K-129 20 August 1968. This is a composite picture using the various pictures taken to show the K-129. So on to the next event. The USS Swordfish, SSN 579, was a member of the Skipjack class. She entered port in Yokosuka, Japan on 17 March 1968. She required emergency repairs to her bent periscope and damage to the forward part of her sail, which was publicly and officially blamed on an iceberg in the Sea of Japan. She had been on a mission to track Soviet submarines as they departed the Soviet base in the Kamchatka Peninsula. Of interest, the Navigation Center of the United States Coast Guard clearly states that there are no icebergs in the Sea of Also remember that regardless of what was being said in public, the Soviet Union was reading all of her encrypted communications thanks to John Anthony Walker. Soviet base is indicated in yellow. And this is Yokosuka, Japan. And this is not Pennsylvania. I can tell from personal experience that's a great place to try students. The Soviet base is indicated in yellow. Oh, I already said that. It should be of no surprise that it was covertly suggested that by the Soviets that the K-129 was lost after a collision with the swordfish. It's very reasonable that the swordfish could have submerged behind or beneath the K-129, providing its position to other U.S. Navy ships of command, so its location would be known. At that time, U.S. submarines were much quieter than Soviets and could hide behind them and track their movements, with a significant acoustic advantage. So what happened? The swordfish could have gotten too close. The K-129 could have submerged without warning. There are many possibilities. The undeniable outcome was that the periscope and sail, the swordfish was damaged, requiring it to return to Yokosuka, Japan for repair. The steering and power system of the K-129 was damaged, so it could not surface or communicate with their home base. It was probably taking on water and could not steer back to port. Instead, it proceeded, like I said, 1,500 miles northwest of Oahu, it sank at 16,560 feet of water, 3.03 miles. All 83%. The official Soviet Navy publicly released a hypothesis that the K-129, while operating in snorkel mode, slipped below its operating depth. Such an event, combined with mechanical failure or improper crew reaction, can cause flooding sufficient to sink the boat. You can see this is where she was supposed to go. She didn't even get across. But remember, the Soviet Union was aware of every classified communication the U.S. Navy sent. This slide shows the timeline of events so far. The timeline is key to explaining the sequence. So what is the U.S. Navy done? October is when Walker became a spy. In December, he actually told the Soviet Union to get a copy of KW-7 arrestees. Photo was taken in January. The swordfish and the K-129 damaged in March. Scorpion was lost in May. K-129 was located. So what does the U.S. Navy do when they've located on the ocean bottom a Soviet submarine with the most modern Soviet Navy ballistic missiles, nuclear torpedoes? Of course, they contact the CIA. Interestingly, the Soviet Union's crypto device could not break the CIA. Only what was transmitted by a U.S. Navy system. This allowed the CIA to get ahead of the Soviets regarding the recovery of the vessel. I'm going to step out of my timeline for a minute now and present one of the most amazing engineering tasks ever undertaken by the United States Navy. This material was not declassified until February 2010. The CIA made a contract with Howard Hughes to use a subcontractor to design a ship that could go out in the open ocean 1,600 miles northwest of Hawaii, have a control platform that would remain perfectly flat no matter the external condition. It would be able to open the bottom of the ship so that all operations were kept from barring eyes. Lower a lifting device 3.03 miles to the bottom of the ocean, grab the K-129 along with its missiles and torpedoes, lift it back up 3.03 miles and hold the ship, then close the bottom without getting caught. Sounds impossible, right? Enter Project Azure. If you research this operation, you may find references to Project Jennifer. Jennifer was the CIA's cover project name for all underwater operations. It was leaked to the Soviet Union by John Anthony Walker, and then they leaked it to the press. It was incorrectly used as Operation to cover the K-129. The actual 129 operation was Azori in a subdivision of Jennifer. In early August 1974, despite incredible political, military, and intelligence risks, and after 6 years of secret preparation, the CIA attempted to salvage the sunken Soviet ballistic missile submarine K-129. Project Azori was the most ambitious ocean engineering endeavor ever attempted. It can be compared to the 1969 moon landing, this level of technical achievement. U.S. intelligence agencies were able to determine the precise location, develop a means of racing a submarine from a depth of 17,000 feet. Previously, the deepest attempt to salvage a submarine had been accomplished at 200 feet. In 2012, PBS did a documentary film entitled Azorian, The Raising of the K-129. It's available on Amazon Prime to watch, or you can go to Amazon Prime. The CIA needed a cover story so the government could not carry out such a project in secrecy. Fortunately, they had access to a multi-billionaire who was always very secretive in his work. The recovery ship was built as the Hughes Glomar Explorer, 1971-72 by Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock in Pennsylvania. It cost more than $350 million, about $1.6 billion today. At the direction of Howard Hughes for use by his company, Global Marine Development, it began operation 20 June 1974. It had a 50,500-ton displacement, 619 feet long and 116 feet across. Compare this to the Titanic. It was 70% as long and 110% as heavy. No one at Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company had any knowledge that the ship was anything other than a bottom mining vessel. It was too large to fit through the Panama Canal and had to go south of South America to get to the Pacific. To carry out this mission of grasping and raising 2,000-ton object in 17,000 feet of water in the Pacific Ocean, it had to have the following attributes: a large center well opening in the hull and a means of sealing it off so that the cover object could be examined under dry conditions. Hydraulic lift system capable of hoisting a heavy large load. Tapered heavy lift pipe string, including tool joints, designed, constructed, and proof tested to exceptionally demanding standards. At a depth of 17,000 feet, this string itself weighed 4,000 tons, and would have to lift an additional 4,250 tons. A claw with mechanically articulated fingers, which could be used, which use surface-applied seawater as hydraulic fluid. The claw would be lowered and raised into the hull using the two mobile lifting towers visible in this picture. These two towers here actually went down. You'll see another picture of it down later. They had the grip lifting device attached to it. Went down and then they opened up under the water. And it needed a motion compensated 755-ton gimbal, 40-foot by 40-foot work that was effectively isolated and suspended from roll, pitch, and heave motions of the ship. The four gimbal bearings could each support 5,000. This is the gimbal support. This was necessary because the hull opened down to allow recovery vessels to be lowered and the submarine raised without anyone outside the ship to determine what it was doing. 17,000-foot lifting string was composed of 570 rods, each 30 feet long. The pipe string outer diameter was 14 inches. Once the bottom was open, it would be attached, the grappling system lowered 30 feet, and then the next one attached. And so on down to the required 17,000 feet. To carry out the mission, a massive claw-like apparatus was built like Lockheed to fit the sub's exact specifications. It was affectionately called Clementine and weighed 2,170 tons. Consisted of two steel beams that were 179 feet long, 31 feet wide. Lifting devices on each end of the apparatus were designed to attach to the device and lift it to the lower part of the ship's hull. You can see it's been lowered down by these and some of this. Hughes told the meeting the ship's purpose was to extract manganese nodules from the ocean floor. The marine geology cover story became surprisingly influential, causing many others to examine the idea. Despite the Soviet Union request for information, the U.S. government officially refused to comment on the Glomar Explorer. This slide shows the official release copy taken from the Gerald R. Ford Library. It says the U.S. Navy has issued no official comment on matters related to the vessel Glomar Explorer. It's the policy of this government not to confirm, deny, or otherwise comment on alleged intelligent activities. This practice is followed by all governments, including the USSR. So regardless of press speculation, there will be no official position on this matter. Interestingly, this is the first official use of the term refused to confirm, deny, or Project Azorian was one of the most complex, expensive, and secretive intelligence operations in the Cold War. Total cost of about $800 million, or about $4 billion today. Interestingly, the operation was very similar to the standard child's claw lifting game. The Glomar Explorer finally reached its destination on July 4th, 1974. Inclement weather delayed the salvage operation for several days. Around the same time as the recovery cage was being lowered into the ocean, the Soviet warship Chasm arrived on the scene carrying a Ka-25 helicopter. The Soviet Navy tug arrived as well to help in monitoring U.S. ships' operation. The Glomar team had to carry on its operations with the Soviet Navy watching. To prevent Soviet helicopters from landing on board, boxes were stacked on the helipad. But what caused the most anxiety during the operation was that debris might float up to the surface once the submarine was lifted off the floor. Although the Soviets felt that this might be an attempt to recover the K-129, after they reviewed the location and determined that a recovery from the open ocean location at a depth of 16,560 feet was simply impossible, they called off its surveillance. On August 9th, the same day that Richard Nixon resigned as president, CIA and Glomar team lifted the remains of the sub into the ship's gigantic lower hull space. The pipe string was lifting 7,127 tons from 16,560. As the CIA inspected the wreckage, several important documents and manuals were recovered, but the most pressing issue was the discovery of several bodies of 98 crew who had died in the subsequent. While 3 of the crew members were identified, the rest were not. By September, all the bodies had been recovered were buried at sea with full honors. A film was taken showing each of the men wrapped in the Soviet flag, laid into a shell container. The container was sealed, lowered into the ocean while the Soviet national anthem was playing in the background. This film was eventually provided to the Soviet Union. Interestingly, between the inner and outer hull of the recovered wreckage, they actually found manganese nodules. The actual missile and torpedo material recovered has not been declassified. Although it's not officially reported how much of the K-129 was recovered, we do know that part of the gravel from these broke off. But it really didn't matter because the Soviet Union had to assume the CIA now had a version of this ballistic missile and nuclear submarine, nuclear torpedo stacks. This meant they had to spend the funds and time to redesign them. So now we return to the time when the Soviet Union knows the U.S. sunk one of its ships, along with its 83 crew. Thanks to Walker, they know this even though the public release officially told a different story. The Soviets knew that the United States was not being used. During my research, I became aware of another book published in 2007 on this subject, Scorpion Down by Ed Offlin. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning reporter and publisher who worked for several newspapers over 30 years, including one in the Norfolk, Virginia area, especially his reporting on military matters. I'll return to the final step of the timeline and include this newly discovered information. The Scorpion was in the Mediterranean following a Soviet submarine when a strange at-sea event began near the Azores. As you'll recall, there were several Soviet ships conducting hydroacoustic operations in the area. But the location and type of this activity was unusual. It was later determined that they were trying to map the U.S. SOSUS devices, information which Walker had released to them, so that they could operate the submarine off the entrance to the Mediterranean without U.S. detection. On May 1968, the USS Hadow, which was also in the Mediterranean, became involved with the Echo 2 Soviet nuclear-powered submarine. Hadow followed it until it entered the Straits of Gibraltar, then reported its location and action to submarine bay. Then on 16 May 1968, the Scorpion was sent from the Mediterranean to monitor the hydroacoustic operation activity and report what it had found. Remember, the Soviets are reading every status report and location report sent by the Hadow and the Scorpion. In addition to the secret SOSUS system, the U.S. was operating to track Soviet submarines. There was also a top secret program called AFTAC, Air Force Technical Application Center. This program involved listening devices, buoys, platforms, and more to look for nuclear or conventional weapons testing at sea. But the system could also provide system information to the U.S. Navy to assist in their systems. On 17 May 1968, the Scorpion landed, met with the tug, offloaded the 2 sailors who had personal reasons to head home, then shifted to top secret status to monitor the hydroacoustic operation activity. On 18 May 1968, Scorpion reported that there was a Soviet submarine in her area. On that day, the USS Josephine Daniels, DLG-27, was scrambled from Norfolk to assist the Scorpion. On 19 May, the U.S. Navy stopped all aircraft flights over the Soviet ship activity. Then on 20 May, Vice Admiral Shea, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy Submarine Force, was on the USS Ray on a training mission. And he received a report that due to Soviet submarine operations, it appeared that the USS Scorpion's mission had been compromised. There was no indication of how this may have happened with John Anthony Walker. On 21 May 1968, the Scorpion sent a position report indicating she was going to head to Norfolk and arrive on 27 May. The message also included a report on the Soviet ship activity, but that part is still classified. On 22 May, the Scorpion failed to make a radio report. Navy intelligence terms began collecting SOSUS tapes from all over the area. Family members in Norfolk were told she would arrive, that her arrival was delayed from the 24th to the 27th. 23 May, she again missed a radio check, and senior military personnel became more concerned. Admiral Shea obtained permission from Admiral Moore to direct a classified search for the Scorpion. On 24 May, USS Compass Island, a navigational research ship, returned to port in Brooklyn in operation in the Caribbean. She had the weekend off, and the crew was sent off for Liberty. Compass Island had a highly classified advanced bottom survey system. She was being used to map the ocean bottom so that the Polaris submarine force would not have to rely on satellites to determine their location if the satellites were destroyed. Later that day, she was ordered to the Azores for a top secret emergency operation. Her directed departure was of such short notice that all her crew didn't have time to return. She got underway with only 60% of her crew. The operation was that important. Compass Island's advanced sonar had the U.S. Navy's best capability to map the ocean bottom. It was so good that its full capability was not declassified until 1990. 27 May 1968, the families gathered on the stormy pier in Norfolk. Scorpion did not arrive. Subland issued a submiss report. On 28 May, the open ocean search began. Mary Island tapes were used to try to determine a possible location for the Scorpion. The U.S. Navy sent ships to the Canary Islands and docked charges in the water, trying to get a similar SOSUS result to the stations that they had taken the tapes. The Canaries and the Newfoundland stations to triangulate the possible location. Interestingly, this is the actual location of the Scorpion. You see, this is only 10 nautical miles. This is their estimates based upon those, putting those charges in the water and trying to track them similar ways. But you will notice that these 4 possible locations, the one that's farthest away is Point Oscar, over here. An interesting statement accompanies this picture. If you read it, it says 4 initial estimates were located by acoustic signals. Due to a misunderstanding, the Mizar continued to search around Point Oscar rather than approach the others. We'll talk in a minute about that misunderstanding. On 1 June, Canadian aircraft CP-107 spotted a Soviet submarine rescue ship with a damaged Soviet submarine alongside near Cape Verde. There was a tarp over the submarine, but there was significant repair welding in progress. On 2 June, open ocean search was now halfway to Norfolk with nothing found so far. The U.S. Navy received pictures of a damaged Soviet submarine being towed northward in the eastern Atlantic. The USNS Mizar left Norfolk to join the search. Mizar had the submarine sled that could do close-up underwater pictures. On 3 June, the Compass Island left open ocean search and headed toward the Azores in response to a Soviet message that provided the location of the Scorpion on the bottom. The message was copied and provided by Admiral Ralph James. Several personnel were questioned by Ed Offling to clarify this reported information from the Soviet Union. All agreed that the Scorpion's location was given by the Soviets. They generally agreed to the background information, which was that the Scorpion was being followed by the Echo II. The Echo 2 was then detected by the Scorpion, and the Scorpion began counter-maneuvers. This involved rapid course and depth changes, basically an underwater dogfight. During this action, it was stated that the Scorpion hit the Echo 2. This caused ship damage, and the Echo 2 felt in danger, so they launched a torpedo at the Scorpion in response. The Soviet Union further stated that since this was in response to an aggressive action, it was justified. The Soviet Union suggested it would be in the best interest of the US if the US stopped all further investigation into this incident. And they agreed in return that the Soviet Union would stop all investigation into the loss of the K-129. On 5 June, the Scorpion was declared lost in the Court of Inquiry. On 6 June, the Compass Island began a focus search in the area provided by the Soviet Union. On 9 June, the Compass Island located the USS Scorpion at the bottom of the location provided by the Soviet Union, not on 30 October, as the Navy officially states, but on 9 June. On 10 June, the official wide area search began, and Vice Admiral Shade was involved in directing this search. He continued to advise the search into Point Oscar, one of the areas determined by the Sosas triangulation. He intentionally avoided the actual location which he had known since 3 June. It suggested that since he had information from the Soviets, it was highly classified. It would be best if the ship not be located until after the Court of Inquiry completed the investigation. Additionally, he did not want the US-Soviet agreement to be part of the Court of Inquiry's investigation. On 25 June, the Compass Island was removed from the search and returned to Brooklyn. On 2 July, the Court of Inquiry, loss of Scorpion, was concluded with no definite cause for the loss. The court suggested it was probably a mechanical failure. Results were submitted to the US Navy and Congress for review and approval. In July, the Miser files indicated she had pictures from her sled of the Scorpion. In September, Vice Admiral Shade recommended the search be put on hold until the spring of 1969 due to bad weather. On 28 October, the Court of Inquiry results had been made official, and the Miser officially released pictures of the Scorpion. The Court of Inquiry met again to review this information, but the cause of the loss was not changed. The Court of Inquiry concluded in January 1969. Remember, the US Navy had originally said the Scorpion was sunk by a hot-blown torpedo. The torpedo activated while still in the torpedo tube, but the pictures taken supported no internal explosion. There was no outward explosion, no indication of complete failure. The only damage was a break inward in the middle of the ship indicating external torpedo. While researching this presentation, I found additional items. It concerns retired US Navy Captain Peter Hutchthausen. He graduated from the Naval Academy in 1962. He retired in 1990 from his military career. He wrote several books, including the K-19, The Widowmaker, which was made into a movie. Captain Hutchthausen was the former naval attaché in Moscow. He related an article from the Maritime Network publication, where I had a brief conversation in 1987 with Soviet admirals concerning the K-129. While he was the naval attaché, Hutchthausen states that Admiral Peter Gavotsia told him, "Captain, you are very young and inexperienced. You will learn that there are some matters that both nations have agreed not to discuss. And one of these is the reasons for the loss of the K-129. Later, in 1995, after retirement, when he began to work on his book about the Soviet underwater fleet, he interviewed Admiral Victor Degallo, who stated that the true history of the K-129 has not been revealed because of the informal agreement between the two countries seen in the naval agreements. The purpose of that secrecy, he alleged, was to stop any further research into the losses of the Scorpion and the K-129. Hutchthausen states that Degallo told him to overlook the matter and hope that the time will come when the truth will be told to the families of the victims. Interestingly, Admiral Degallo appears on the Project Azorian video. In the Azorian video, he states that he believes the K-129 was sunk after a collision with the USS Swordfish. This is an audio recording from that part of the Azorian video.
I had all reasons to assume that it was the submarine Swordfish that sunk our submarine, although unintentionally. That is still my conviction, and I will never give up this belief, and I will defend it in front of anybody.
Admiral Degallo bases this accusation on an intercepted communication by Soviet intelligence. stated the USS Swordfish had set course for Yokosuka, Japan, and also that it had carried out extensive emergency repairs to its sail area at the US base there, under a veil of total secrecy.
This is their interpretation of the actual accident. I don't agree with this one because I don't think that K-129 would have been sideways to it. In response to the Admiral's comment near the end of the Azorian video, there's a disclaimer of the U.S. providing the Soviets with the actual USS Swordfish handwritten daily operating logs in 1992, showing it was nowhere near the K-129. I researched the U.S. Naval Archives, where copies of all U.S. Navy ship deck logs are kept. Interestingly, there is no copy of this purported operating log in the District Archives. This video also shows the Swordfish's periscope damage, but it shows the back of the sail and says there's no damage, but it doesn't show the front of the sail. This is the official quote from the U.S. Navy, still to this day. Remember, the U.S. Navy officials stated, insist that Commander slaughtering his 98 crewmen on the Scorpion perished as a result of some unknown malfunction and not any sinister event. Remember, these are the same people that kept assuring their families and relatives that the Scorpion would arrive in Norfolk very soon, even after they knew the ship was lost at sea. As a final submission, I have a copy of a statement from Seaman Vince Collier, also from Scorpion down. 1982, Vince was attending a top secret Navy school in Norfolk, Virginia. He was to become an ocean system technical analyst. This required him to study and learn how to interpret SOSUS and AFTAC recordings. In those days, before computers were common, they would listen to the recording and the system would imprint the data lines on electrosensitive paper. They studied, reviewed, and reported an actual classified SOSUS records with the goal to accurately describe what the instructor knew to be the actual origin of the recording. With just a day left before graduation and orders to their fleet assignments, Collier recalled one of the senior instructors announced he had a surprise for the class. Ocean System Technical Analyst, First Class, Richard Falk, walked into the classroom and held up what appeared to be another SOSUS training tape. He said, "Watch this, you're going to love this one." He started the tape, the actuator started painting a detailed image on the paper. The students watched intently as the low-frequency analyzer and recorder brand, the LOFAR brand, began to recreate the acoustic signal from the underwater computation. Seaman Collier stated that from the beginning of the tape, we saw a noise, blade rate, and we saw two intertwined blade rates and two intertwined turbines. We were watching two submarines. There was a sprint and drift and crazy turns, Collier said, referring to the tactical maneuvers. The students were mesmerized as they translated the patterns of the electrostatic paper into a mental image of two submarines in an underwater dogfight. The presentation went on for over 20 minutes, and suddenly the students gasped. The ground writer clearly showed a torpedo launch from the submarines. The next thing he saw was a high-speed torpedo signature. The torpedo blade rate was steady. We could also see the signal showing the submarine shifting in size and width as it tried to maneuver away from it. The encounter ended with a sudden violence, and the paper was completely blackened by the strength of the signal. One student asked, "Are we seeing a submarine biting a bullet?" Then Falk stated, "This is the death of the USS Scorpion. That was a Russian torpedo signal, but officially it's not." One student asked, "Why not?" Officially, the Scorpion sank because of a mechanical failure. The students were amazed. Falk had presented them a tape to analyze, and they had been exactly correct in their analysis. While discussing this with the author 17 years later, Collier mentioned that this tape had many more sounds than they were used to hearing on SOSUS tapes. He suggested it was based on his later experience, this was probably an AFTAC tape. He also recalled walking up to the desk at the end of the class and looking at the tape. It was clearly marked top secret USS Scorpion. So what was behind the loss of the USS Scorpion and the associated cover? When the Echo II reacted to the Scorpion's interaction with the torpedo, the Soviets had two large problems. They had just sunk a U.S. submarine, and the only way that submarine would have known about the Scorpion and her mission was due to some external source, since their acoustic capability did not match it. They had to immediately stop all further U.S. investigation of this action to prevent revealing John Anthony Walker as their inside source. The K-129 gave them that bargaining chip. They knew the US had lied about the Soviet involvement, or swordfish involvement. They could kill two birds with one stone. We will stop investigating the K-129 and we will stop investigating the Scorpion. So who was really responsible for the loss of the USS Scorpion? There's clearly only one answer: John Anthony. Without him, the Soviets would not have known about the swordfish's involvement in the K-129, nor would they have been able to quickly track and locate the USS Scorpion. Nothing can change the loss of the Scorpion and the K-129 and the hardships for the families left behind. May our future losses be data and not losses. The role of espionage continues today. Thank you. Anybody have any questions?
What happened to Walker?
Walker was in prison for life. By the time he was caught, he had expanded his network because he kept getting promoted, and then he didn't have access to the data he needed. So he had a friend who took over that for him, and then he had his brother who took over part, and then his son. So there were four of them involved. And when Walker got caught, he agreed to tell him everything he knew that would cut the imprisonment for his son. So they agreed to cut his son to 12 years. The other three were all getting life in prison. Walker and his brother died in prison. The other guy that he hired is still in prison. Of course, he's yes, sir.
Why has U.S. policy changed so we don't have another war?
Steve, can you repeat the question?
Why has U.S. policy changed so we don't have?
Why hasn't it?
Why hasn't it changed? Well, I'm hoping that it has. First of all, so many things have changed. If you think about it, if I took a top secret document and I walked into the U.S. Soviet embassy, there would probably be 5 FBI agents waiting for me when it came out because of all the cameras they have today. He didn't have those in those days. The other thing to me is that the security is much, much tighter. The checks are much tighter. I had a top secret clearance when I worked in Naples, Italy, and I had to have a lie detector test every quarter. So everybody in my staff had it. So I think that we have changed. I think we have made more secure. But the other problem, of course, is today so much of what we do is done electronically. Crypto hacking and that sort of thing is. So it's a whole different game. I don't have the knowledge to answer on that basis.
Well, a lot of ways you can catch somebody like this is that the standard of living changes. Is there any kind of system to watch for that?
Well, if they were watching that, I mean, nobody came to look at my house when I was in the Navy. Nobody checked my car,
As far as you know.
That's what, as far as I'm know. Maybe I need to check that file again. Yes, sir.
Was the death penalty in play on Walker?
No, sir. It was just like in prison.
I remember the Glomar Explorer controversy when it occurred, which gave rise to a lot of concern about scooping manganese nodules on the ocean floor. Among the people involved trying to do that was actually my brother, who was a physicist. But that lost attention. But just recently, the news, just this year, there are new attempts to do that in view of the value, not just of the manganese nodules, but other nodules of important use.
Well, actually, I was on patrol and directed to stay away from that area because the Glomar Explorer was mining manganese nodules. Yes, sir.
Was the pressure ever raised?
No, sir. The thresher was never raised, and I've had people ask me, why didn't they take the crew that with the Titanic and go to the thresher? And I think it's just a case of they wouldn't gain any knowledge by raising it. It would just make a relight that loss for all the people involved. And really, if you look at it, submarines generally aren't raised up from it. So they've never gone after the thresher.
I had an uncle that was in the Navy at the time. He had something to do with a search for it. I thought they put diving belts down into it or something.
They definitely have done the same thing they did with the Titanic, gone through it, looked at it, and researched it. That's part of the reason they were able to determine 2 things happened. Like I said, the hull piping, the piping broke, but they also had a problem because they did the emergency blow. And the emergency blow was made to work at 300 feet. And they're at 1,300 feet, and the thing iced over, it froze. Because it was so much colder down. Any other questions? Thank you very much. And again, I really.
It's a hell of a story.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, like I said, those two books are now released, and so more information is out now.
Thank you, Steve. So, are there any announcements for the good of the order? The meeting's adjourned.